Hey guys, welcome back to the next episode of the DFM podcast. It's now episode 5, yeah it is, and I'm back with another composer. As you can see, we're actually doing video for this one, so something a bit different. I'm joined by JJay Berthume. Like the other episodes, I won't introduce him, I'll let him introduce himself. So JJay, go ahead, introduce yourself, whatever sort of background you want to give yourself and up to now, what you're getting up to, and we'll get into it.
Awesome. Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Dean. So I mean, I really would just consider myself first and foremost a musician. I've been playing piano since I was 5 years old, not really seriously, just kind of noodling around, but I spent a lot of time experimenting. I've always kind of been a tinkerer by temperament. I always was kind of a nerd and enjoyed like science kits and things. And so you wouldn't think that I'd be someone who would be interested in going into like the arts or music, but I always thought music was just really interesting because you could kind of apply that tinkery mindset, in the sciences. If you apply the tinkery mindset, you can like create things, you can kind of understand the world and manipulate it, but there's not really an emotional component. And as a kid, I was also kind of an emotional kid, and I really loved listening to music, and I loved nature. And so for me, composing music, improvising music, creating music, every aspect of just, making music satisfied the kind of tinker science part of my brain. But it also kind of, when you create music, it makes you feel something. And that unique kind of combination of kind of left brain and right brain is what, really, I think, drew me to music. But, how I got here now, I mean, I was homeschooled, which was actually a fantastic thing. I know that's some people, I'm not going to be one of those people who says that homeschooling is good or bad, but my parents were great at it. They did a fantastic job, and I'm very grateful for that. And it gave me a ton of free time to just spend messing around on instruments, experimenting on the piano, just toying around with things. A lot more free time than I think someone who went to was involved in the public school system would be able to have. So that was a huge boon for me. After high school, or after I kind of finished high school and all of my subjects, because with homeschooling it's kind of weird because you can get ahead or behind grades with different subjects. But in any case, I took a gap year. Wasn't really intending to be a gap year. It was more just like I didn't think that I needed a college. It's not that I didn't think I needed a college education. It's that I was interested in writing music for games and films, and especially like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, kind of Chrono Trigger. A lot of those video game soundtracks really had a heavy influence on me. I was a huge fan of the music of John Williams, Bernard Herrmann, Danny Elfman, James Newton Howard. And so I really wanted to just get into writing media music. That was kind of my idea for my career. And I knew that most of the video game developers and directors were not particularly interested in having, a piece of paper as qualification. They just wanted to know, what's your portfolio? What's your previous experience? Do they like your music? Do they like to work with you? And so for me, spending tons of, thousands upon thousands of dollars to go to a university to get a piece of paper, which ultimately, wouldn't help me specifically. But I think that was actually a little bit narrow-minded. And I ended up I did go to college, and I'll kind of tell you a little kind of story of what that was. So, so about halfway into my quote-unquote gap year, again, I thought I just graduated and wasn't going to go to college, but it ended up being a gap year. I went and saw a concerto competition by Furman University, a great kind of local liberal arts college with a pretty good music program, especially for in the South. South Carolina is known for having the best educational system, but Furman's, one of the good universities in South Carolina. But in any case, I saw them perform. I saw a bunch of the students perform in a concerto competition: oboe concerto, marimba concerto, even John Williams tuba concerto. And I just loved it so much, and it really gave me this hunkering, this kind of like yearning to write and for real players. And I also had thought in the past too, like I don't really want to write concert music. Because I'm really kind of a melody guy. Like I love writing tunes. I love writing accessible music that people enjoy listening to. I'm not the type of person to write some kind of strange esoteric kind of piece of music that only a few people can understand the mathematics of. But something about just that experience just kind of changed my conceptualization of my life. And I thought, maybe I can just broaden my scope of how I conceptualize myself. And rather than thinking myself as a film or game composer, I can just think of myself as a musician, and I can play piano and, compose for advertisement, for my own albums, for concert music, and just basically do everything in music that is of interest to me. Now, there's of course a problem with that. spreading yourself too thin. And obviously from a marketing perspective, it's important to be able to devote enough time. And I would say that's been the biggest issue for me. And I don't regret it. I think it'll still, I feel like it's taking longer because of so many different things, writing, educational books, creating YouTube content, trying to increase the production value with regards to that, writing music for a theme park on the side. I just wrote an 11-song musical for a local called The Inspector of Oz for a local theater company, which ran for a few weekends, So, but anyway, just to, finish the life story, so to speak. So I went to Furman University and I auditioned because I thought, you know what, if I don't get any scholarship money, I have no obligation to go to the university. But for me, the change was, it's not about the piece of paper, it's about the experience, right? And with Furman University in particular, and any kind of music college, just having that environment of being around fellow musicians and being able to collaborate and other composers. And there were two professors at Furman in particular, which I was interested in. And I think this is maybe an important kind of piece of advice for someone who is interested in going to music school and is trying to pick the right music school. To me, the faculty are much more important than the name recognition of the school. If you get into Juilliard or Eastman, it's like, all well and good. Whoa, you got into Juilliard, but maybe you hate the composition teacher's music, right? And it's a very subjective thing. And so the, two professors that I really hit it off well with at Furman. One was Dr. Mark Kilstoff, who is a brilliant choral composer. He's written lots of different instrumentations, but he focuses on choral music and just everything from text setting to early Renaissance vocal music. And he's also kind of a master of 16th century counterpoint. And there was a class that was offered at Furman called 16th century counterpoint. And I was kind of a nerd and obsessed with counterpoint. So just the prospect of going and studying counterpoint at, the university was almost enticing enough on its own. But notwithstanding that, there was also another professor, J.Jay Berthume, and there are a couple of things that I liked about J.Jay Berthume. One, he is just the nicest man. Well, first I'll tell you what is, kind of who he is. He arranges, and he's one of the most famous arrangers and composers for wind ensemble, right? For band, for wind ensemble, very popular, especially in the United States. He's written a lot of music for Blue Devils and a lot of drum lines and percussion lines and things like that. So he's kind of got a big name here, and he just is as a brilliant orchestrator in particular. He's definitely a good composer, but his real brilliance in my mind is his orchestration. He just knows all of these kinds of interesting little texts. He's like a man who collects textures. He just listens and listens and listens and listens to all kinds of music from so many different genres. And anytime he finds some little texture thing that he likes, he just has this massive library. But it's not just a bunch of recipes, because he also, he understands the fingering. I thought I had a decent grasp of orchestration going into Furman, but man, Boca, he knew all the he could look at a French horn part and tell you exactly how playable it is and what the positions are, even not being a French horn player. And so just that technical understanding of all the instruments I really admired and wanted to absorb a little bit. And so in my time at Furman, I kind of went back and forth, having a private study with Bocook and with Kilstoff. And, but I also just found myself enjoying, I feel like college is something also that depends upon temperament. I know a lot of people get frustrated, let's say, for example, if you get a liberal arts education and you're studying to become a chemistry major, but you also have to take some literary text analysis and you analyze Shakespeare, a lot of people would be frustrated with that. They'd be like, I want to be a chemist. Why do I need to study Shakespeare, right? Yeah. And someone, maybe a thespian studying Shakespeare, just who loves Shakespeare, maybe hates that he or she has to take a chemistry class, right? And so some people like to have a more specialized kind of trade school focus. I had thought that was going to be me, honestly, because I had always thought that I was going to be, I was going to be a composer, and that was my primary focus in musician, even broadening to musician. But I found that I actually loved psychology, philosophy, even Hindustani religion and a bunch of different. I just really actually quite enjoyed the education that I received a lot from Furman, in addition to just the musical aspect. But anyway, my focus was in music composition and also minoring in jazz piano. I played a lot of jazz piano in the big band and with combos, and that was a huge thing because I knew hardly anything about jazz. except for just, you know, the very basics historically about like swing and bebop, but I wasn't a good jazz improviser. I didn't know that much about jazz harmony. And so that was another huge thing, you know, before I went to Furman and after I went to Furman, jazz, you know, that jazz was kind of like added to my palette. And I've been actually a lot more interested in improvising, you know, on the piano and stuff recently.
Yeah, I've seen on your YouTube videos that you have been,
Yeah. So anyway, graduated, and then here we are. Last spring graduated, and then here we are in April, May. And so since then, I've just been doing lots of different fun little music projects. I've been doing orchestration projects. I've been doing engraving projects. I've been composing a lot, you know, writing concert music on the side. I wrote my first symphony at Furman. I just started my second symphony. I just finished my first string quartet. And my current big focus, to kind of wrap this big thing up, is that I've always loved teaching. I've just enjoyed it so much. And I think there's this interesting kind of dichotomy where there are a lot of, and I honestly don't think it's a talent thing at all, because I tend to believe that, you know, hard work is much more important than any kind of like innate talent. But in any case, you know, Bernstein is a good example of someone who he was a brilliant composer and an excellent conductor, and also he had a passion for education. It's really rare to find that combination, right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of me thinks that's a matter of temperament and personality. So, like, for example, I knew this pianist who taught jazz and improvisation at Furman, and he was one of the piano faculty there, and he's an excellent player. Like, he plays jazz, and he just, you know, it's just a beautiful player and has this deep intuitive understanding. And but he's the type of guy that you'd sit there and be like, hey, you know, you put a tune in front of him that you wrote, and he would just sit and play this beautiful solo over it, just improvise. And you'd be like, what did you do? What was that? And he'd be like, I don't know what I did, man. Like, you'll have to record it and analyze it yourself, you know. And you've met people like that, you know. And so it's rare, you know, to find someone who also wants to analyze their own music and kind of, from a pedagogical perspective, figure out how to teach. Because for me, teaching is its own thing. Like, I don't know, I'm not at all gonna, you know, say whether or not I'm a good or bad teacher. I'll let that for other people to decide. But I take teaching very, very seriously. And to me, a lot of musicians feel that the very fact that they are competent in their field and instrument qualifies them to be a teacher. But for me, that's not the way that I personally conceptualize it. For me, it's like, yes, you have to, in order to teach piano, you've got to be a great piano. Yeah. But you also have to, like, understand how to teach. And it's interesting too, because, like, when a classroom setting is completely different from private lessons. So one of the things that I've just absolutely just loved doing private lessons. And when I first started doing, I actually had never thought of myself as wanting to become a teacher. And when I was like 14 years old, my mom said, she's like, you know, listen, like, I know that, like, you don't want to teach, because my idea was like, I don't want to teach anyone until I've got some qualification and, like, you know, because but in any case, my mom had said to me, she's like, listen, you know, I've gotten to this point of playing piano ability. It's like, you at the very least can teach, you know, kind of younger people piano where you're above their ability. Like, don't feel bashful about it. There's nothing wrong with charging. And I didn't want to charge, you know, because I was just kind of like, that was just my personality. And that's also a big problem too, like the whole money thing. Like, and I'm not at all saying this as like like I'm bragging or like it's a good thing, because sometimes it's a bad thing. Money, like, my personality, I don't care about money at all. I've never cared about money. I've never cared about how much money I make for a gig. All I care about is, like, is it meaningful? Is it artistic? Am I helping people out? But I feel like that's going a little bit too far in that altruistic direction. Actually, it can hamper a little bit the business side of things, right? So I think it's still important to be like a nice person and to be generous with your time and help other people out. But it's also important to understand that, like, you can help a wider variety of people if you don't give things away as often. So it's not that I've, you know, necessarily turned into like a kind of shrewd, you know, businessman by any stretch of the imagination, but I've gotten a little bit more understanding of the value of money as a tool to accomplish things that hopefully ultimately for me, you know, have altruistic value. But anyway, going back to the point about teaching, once I finally bit the bullet, so to speak, and started teaching, I then eventually started, I created a YouTube channel where I basically had well, I had written a lot of music that was on my YouTube channel before I had created tutorials, but I had searched a lot on YouTube for basically what I wanted was, I was like, can some composer somewhere just show me their orchestral score and go through it bit by bit? And nowadays we actually have quite a bit of great content on YouTube and that kinds of stuff. But back when I was growing up, there was nothing. There was just literally nothing, except for just a couple of people who didn't really know what they were talking about. Or someone who didn't know what they were talking about, but they didn't, explain things clearly enough or didn't have the kind of illustration. So I kind of like progressed a little bit, and I was really terrible at orchestration at around 13 years because I knew nothing. And I kind of like spent 3 or 4 years and really just like read a bunch of orchestration manuals, checked out Thomas Goss's fantastic Orchestration Online YouTube channel, joined the Orchestration Online community. I was a huge I spent a lot of time on Orchestration Online between the ages of 14 and 16, just posting music on there all the time, having people just, tear it apart and constructively criticize it, just loving that. And so once I got to a point where I feel like I had a fairly decent kind of ability to write orchestration sounding at least, mildly professional, then I decided to just, I had written some music for a local YouTube kind of TV show, so to speak, that some local filmmakers were writing, and it's called The Adventures of Iguana Man. I don't even think it's still on YouTube. But in any case, I wrote a kind of main theme for them, and I was pretty proud of it. I was like, wow, it's like a minute-long piece of music, and I painstakingly kind of orchestrated the whole thing to kind of sound really John Williams-y. Anyway, I created a tutorial on YouTube, just going through the score bit by bit, right? And then that ended up getting a lot of views, surprisingly to me, and then I just started making more content. But anyway, my point is there are people who are great who love teaching, but they're kind of theorists and they don't have a lot of experience in the field. You know what I mean? They're kind of impractical, so to speak. And there are a lot of practical, pragmatic field kind of, but they've spent so much time in the field that they haven't practiced.
Can't get their point across
correctly.
They
can't get their point across. So I still definitely feel like I'm constantly trying to improve the way that I verbalize things and explain things. But anyway, last point about teaching so many different students. One of the things that's just been so edifying and which I've just loved some of the most meaningful aspects of my life I've just been teaching so many different students privately because I'm at the point now where I've taught amazingly. I don't even know how, because I'm only 24 years old, but, and it scares me to think that I was teaching people, 5 or 6 years ago. What did I tell them? But I've taught over like 300 people from different countries.
That's crazy.
And it's just the so many different personalities and so much individuality and different people just writing different music. And I've heard so much beautiful music. People are listening online to YouTube, and they're like, oh, people don't write good music anymore. And it's like, no, it's because you're looking in the mainstream places where it was just completely, controlled by whoever has the most money for advertisement, right? But like here I am hearing this music written by all these students, just like so many really talented students, and like they haven't even shared their stuff with the world yet, right? So that just gives me the super optimistic view of the current state of composition and stuff. But anyway, and it's also, I know it's a kind of a cliche to say that when you teach, it makes you a better, composer, performer. But like it really does.
No, it really does, yeah.
Absolutely, the way having to, and even just to me, there's this kind of illusion that happens sometimes where one thinks that if, like, let's say you get to a point where you have you've gotten a master's degree in guitar performance and you feel comfortable and confident teaching, right? There's a part of that person's brain. It's like either you're going to be not confident enough that you have an inaccurate understanding of yourself based upon where you are, or you're overconfident and you think that you know everything with regards. Well, you know more than your student with regards to what you're teaching, right? And although that may be the case generally over, span, that's just that's crystallized knowledge, right? So even if you might know information that your student might not know, your student might have a unique intuitive understanding that is different than yours and complements yours. And even that, if you try and explain something, the act of just explaining it and continuing to formulate it helps you make sense of it in your brain for your own purposes. But thirdly, in addition to all of that, the students will ask questions that you have never considered before, right? Because every human brain is intelligent and beautiful in its own way and has their own unique thoughts. And so I've definitely, it's not even like to say that you learn from your students is kind of a trick of the words. You know, people just think like, oh, like you're not really learning from your student. You're just getting better at understanding because of the fact you're being forced to regurgitate. It's like, no, sometimes you literally do actually very often learn from your student. And so just having that big giant kind of like experience of teaching all these different people and just getting that, I feel like it's been super healthy, and has made me a better composer and just a better human being in general. So anyway, sorry for the long kind of spiel, but that's just a kind of an idea of some of the things that I've been doing.
That was great. So as you can see, JJ's a very busy man. Gets up to a lot of things.
Probably too busy.
Yeah, and you have but you touched on loads of things, and I've probably actually maybe forgot some of it. You've came from a background a lot like myself. Actually, like I've came through university of doing a BMus degree over here in Ireland, and I would agree with that sort of statement they made. Picking the university actually based on the staff is just as important. Like when I first was looking into university courses, first one I went and picked was DIT college over here. They have a really good performance base, but the teacher that taught me saxophone and clarinet growing up, he was heavily involved in it. So I was like, okay, I'll go learn there. But that was the main reason I picked there. I don't enjoy performance, but they're mainly performance based. But it's like I'm used to that, so I'll just go apply there. Second, I had Trinity College because Trinity College has a very big name over here in Ireland, and they're pretty well respected, but their music department is not that great at all. Okay. Lucky enough, I actually got refused from both of them, and I got offered my third choice from Maynooth University. But they actually it turned out they actually had the largest musicology department in Ireland, which I didn't know at the time. They had the largest composition department, which I didn't know at the time. So I kind of fell into just a good spot by chance to an extent, but it was really, really good. And the staff were really, really generous. But what you're saying about finding people that are just really, really good at their craft, but that's one thing that I find good about college. Like college didn't really open up business doors for me in the slightest. I didn't come out with my degree suddenly getting film or game jobs offered to me at all. But I did come out with connections. I know I can now, if I need a vocal line record, I have loads of opera singers that I can suddenly go and contact. I can contact individual performers that can record pieces for me. I've met composers along the way that I can get orchestration help from, or different things along the way. Like it didn't offer me jobs, but it offered me experience because I got to compose for live players while I was there as well. Meet connections within the industry and just different things. So that was one thing that I probably would say is actually the biggest benefit of college is actually just getting the experience out of it. It might not hand you a job, but you will learn a lot sort of along the way.
No, and I think also too that it depends upon the college too. Like Berkeley, for example, you know, I've heard a lot of different stories about Berkeley, and even like just, you know, Cal Arts and a lot of different there are some schools that I feel are more traditional classical kind of, whether it's a conservatory or liberal arts, and their goal is not really to give you much with the way of business and marketing, but to give you a traditional kind of classical music education. And you know, the advantage of there is having great players. And also there's a certain amount of decision making that has to happen, whether or not you want to be like a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a large pond. And most people prefer one over the other. I don't think there's necessarily one option that is better. It just depends upon what your temperament is. Like for me, I think if you're a kind of self-motivated kind of person, which is not everyone, but again, I think there are advantages and disadvantages. If you're a kind of self-motivated person, then actually being a big fish in a small pond can be really helpful, because you don't need someone around you immediately who's better than you to incentivize you to get better. Like it doesn't matter who I'm around, you know, I am constantly listening to people who are better than me. I'm constantly listening to Mozart and Bach and Beethoven and Radhavara and Boulanger and Jacob Collier and just so like I very, very rarely ever have a sense of like, oh, like, you know, I'm a good composer. You know, I just don't think in those terms at all. And I also think one of the things that I love about music is that it's completely non-competitive. You know, so with the case of like, let's say,
do you mean in the creative sense compared to the business sense?
I'll elaborate. So in both in the business and in the creative sense. So if, let's say, you know, pick another kind of field, like if you're going to pick a PhD thesis kind of topic, right? And let's say that you're going to like particle physics or something, right? there are very, very few topics that haven't been thoroughly addressed by that theoretical physics community, right? And so your PhD thesis is going to end up on some like esoteric, you know, kind of like property of some kind of particle that has no bearing on reality or something. Or if, you know, even if you're going to be a music theorist, well, you still have to pick a piece to sort of analyze, or, you know, you're not going to be creating some sort of new theoretical framework in your thesis. But one of the great things about composition is that if you're going to, you know, get with sort of a PhD in music composition, like you're just writing a piece of music, and, you know, and like, and it's not that difficult, not even talking about whether or not it's a good or bad piece of music or idiomatic or well put together. It is not difficult to write a piece of music that just has not existed before you wrote it. Right? You know, because there's just so many infinite possibilities. And like, and here's another great example. Like, there was this composer whose name was Robert Cushing at Ferment, fantastic composer, brilliant tunesmith, and he loved writing music for musicals, right? And he was, you know, brilliant musical writer, and he just, I mean, that was his wheelhouse, and that's totally different from my, I don't know that much about writing for musicals, you know, and any of that kind of stuff. And writing music for films and games was kind of my focus. And so we constantly kind of like, you know, we could have been easily rivals in an alternate universe, right? But we weren't. We got along super well. We're good friends with each other. He wrote his own stuff, and I listened to it. It was like, man, that's beautiful, and would give him, you know, constructive feedback. I would write stuff, and he would listen to it and be like, man, I love that. And he would give me constructive feedback. And then we would go produce things that then the audience, and I just love that. I love it so much that there's just a whole group of composers can all just simultaneously make their own different things. We can all encourage each other, not to get better than each other, but to get better at being each other.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the good. It's just it's a field. It's so object, especially composition. Like within sort of music theory, you find that there can be a bit of a hierarchy sometimes when it comes to people's opinions on certain things. But composition is just so subjective, really, to different people's opinions, and there's so many different point of views that people can bring across. Like, I find nowadays, especially in like the college setting, well, over here in Ireland anyways, a lot of us focus on like 21st century sort of contemporary concert music when you look to analyze people. And I don't particularly enjoy that style of music. Like, I don't enjoy analyzing, because I find some of the pieces are pieces just for the sake of being music, saying like they've used this sort of set of numbers to write a piece, and I was like, just enjoy writing the music. Don't feel like you have to fit it into something to say, okay, this is within this sort of brand of music.
There's an interesting direction we could take with regards to that about 20th century music. So 2 points to make, which I'm interested to hear what you think about this. So one, with regards to 20th century music, I completely agree. A lot of the time, a lot of the pieces of music that are written are created for the purpose of impressing one's colleagues or exploring mathematical patterns, which may be interesting from a mathematical perspective, but maybe don't correlate into any kind of a coherent musical, emotional or aesthetic musical. And so there's a kind of philosophical question about what music needs to be. And I'm not the type of person that thinks that music needs to be something. So I'm totally cool if anyone wants to write any kind of music that they want. I just don't think that they should promulgate that.
That's it. Exactly.
So you know, the idea that serialism used to be the only serious, that's kind of. But even notwithstanding that, you know, I've also learned over the years that to not, there was a specific experience, so if I can share an anecdote.
Yeah.
So Aaron Copland, a composer that I often did not like a lot when I was growing up. I listened to kind of his clarinet concerto. I listened to his piano variations, and what I listened to sounded to me to be either it was like very dissonant, and I couldn't really, you know, understand it very well or relate to it, like the piano variations, which is actually a piece of music that I love now. But in any case, or it was kind of like cowboy Americana, and that I wasn't really a huge fan of that kind of cowboy Americana aesthetic. And so after listening to like 5 or 6 Copland pieces, I just made the assumption, back when I was like, you know, I don't know, a kid, I made the assumption that I didn't like Aaron Copland. And so then I just didn't listen to a lot of Aaron Copland. And then, you know, later on, I discovered a piece of music. We were learning how to write for organ at Furman, and Charles Tompkins, who's a brilliant organist and the organ professor there. One of the pieces of music he'd recommended that I listened to was Aaron Copland's Organ Symphony, right? Which I don't know if you've heard that piece, but oh my gosh, it is just it is one of my favorite pieces of all time. It's like in my top 5 list. But anyway, I listened to that and I was just blown away. I was like, there's no way that Copland could have written this. And then I thought to myself, wait a second, I'm being silly. You know, Copland is a complex human being with, I mean, look about Stravinsky. Stravinsky had like so many different styles and periods. And so from then on, I feel like I kind of learned the lesson, like, if you don't like one country song, don't assume that you hate all of country music, right? Or if you don't like 120, and that's especially true with 20th century music, because there's so much variety. And I know that wasn't at all what you were, you were talking specifically about serialism,
like some people like don't like minimalism, but there's some aspects of minimalism that I do actually enjoy. And funny enough, minimalism is actually, I think, a genre that kind of fits well into some media scoring nowadays as well. To an extent.
I personally actually, I love minimalism. And I think there's a little bit of that has to do with kind of like, kind of Asperger's. So I actually have Asperger's, which is a kind of high functioning autism. And so there are a lot of things that I found that are things that, like, for example, when I went and studied music at Furman, let's say like under Dr. Kilstoff, one of the things that he had pointed out all the time, which was a good piece of advice, he's like, listen, like, I know you like symmetry in music, but it might be nice to introduce more asymmetry, right? And so I would always write 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, things like that, which are kind of commonly done. And even though I would kind of over time expand my harmonic language and my music would sound like 20th century, it still didn't have that kind of rhythmic interest. And so Kilstoff had pointed that out to me, and I was like, okay, well, let me kind of go back and think about this. And so I found a lot of the music that I liked, and I found that actually I really enjoy music that has some sort of like consistent pulse to it. Right? Yeah, and I feel like that's a little bit, there's a certain part of that which may have to do with kind of like, repetitive actions with slight change are comforting to anyone on the autism spectrum. So part of that, but then again, that's an exacerbation of kind of just most human beings like repetition. And so balancing repetition and variety is something that, a lot of different musicians think about. But anyway, the point that I want to make here is that if like Mozart, for example, one of the things that I realized is that Mozart is a composer who is, generally speaking, very symmetrical and very, kind of tunes, but he toys around with expectations of symmetry. And so there's this great example from like the A minor piano sonata where he basically creates a phrase that and the phrase, once you get to the 8th bar, he created an extension so that it sounds like the phrase is going to be 9 bars long. Like, you're sure the phrase is going to be 9 bars long. But at the moment that the ending happens on bar 9, he begins a new phrase, right? Yeah. And so it still ends up being an 8-bar phrase, but you had thought it was going to be a 9-bar phrase, and he shaved a bit off of it. So it's like symmetrical, but also with the implication of asymmetry, right? And so, and that was something that I ended up kind of exploring a lot. But it's interesting, with regards to the subjectivity of music, to kind of differentiate things and not just, necessarily assume that because you don't enjoy, because there are 2 different ways of listening to a piece of music. If you just listen to a piece of music and just sort of bathe in it, that's wonderful, a wonderful thing to do as a human being, but also, you don't learn a lot specifically about kind of what's happening unless you actually kind of pay attention. And once you pay attention to music, you can differentiate it. So just like if you had a soup, a great cook might taste a soup and they'll be like, I don't really like this soup, but that ingredient that you put in combination with this ingredient was actually really yummy. And I actually want to take that outside of the soup and use it in another context, right? So Mozart, I actually don't, this could be a little bit of a controversial opinion, but I subjectively don't enjoy listening to a lot of Mozart. Now, there is quite a bit of Mozart that I absolutely love, like the G minor symphony, the Requiem. So it's not that I dislike Mozart, but most of Mozart, he kind of flirts with the ear. He even said in a quote, music should always charm and flatter the ear and always remain, music. So he had this kind of lighthearted kind of, which a lot of people enjoy. A lot of people who think people take music too seriously like that kind of lighthearted attitude. And sometimes I'm in the mood for it and think that it's fun. But in any case, I can still learn a ton about Mozart, with the formal structure and melodic structure. And it's important to not conflate the surface structure of whether or not you like the way that they put the whole meal together with the individual ingredients. And so even if they're like serialism, even if there's a serialist like Schoenberg, for example, and his pieces, like 12 pieces for orchestra, those are brilliantly orchestrated
brilliant pieces, yeah.
Like, yeah.
The same with Bartok. Bartok has a few pieces like that as well, yeah.
Absolutely. But yeah, so even if one doesn't enjoy an aspect of a piece of music, it's important to not let that blind oneself from the fact that you can still learn so much technically from a craft perspective, even from a composer who you quote unquote don't like, right?
Yeah, no, if you start getting into the mindset where you're like, no, just because I dislike that form of music, I won't physically learn something from it. Well, then you're being a bit closed-minded to an extent. Obviously, people
Yeah.
have their favorites to listen to. Like when it comes to classical music, like I'm not biased towards romantic music, but my favorite style of classical concert music would be more likely late romantic period. Like I just adore that music.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but people also, even if you don't like a composer, or could even be an artist, a singer, songwriter today, they go through periods where they can change. Like you were talking about composer, I sort of just thought of Liszt because again, I was thinking of romantic composers. Liszt in his early stage is much different to Liszt as later stage. Same with jazz music. John Coltrane is much different in his early stage to where he is in his later
Right.
stage. So
Right.
like people can change. You might not like them at the start. You could like them at the end, or it could be the opposite way around. You could.
Right. And that's, I feel like that's also a difficult thing. I feel like there are so many artists who would have changed if they weren't told not to, you know. There are a lot of, I'm trying to think of a specific example. Not one isn't coming to head, but I'm sure our listeners will think of an example of like a pop artist who developed a certain style that ended up becoming really popular. And then they got bored of it and wanted to do something different, but their whole audience ditched them the moment they did something differently from what they expected. Right. So I think it's wonderful. That's one of the reasons why I'm not a kind of snob necessarily when it comes to the mainstream music stuff. I don't have a ton of animosity towards it, but I feel like with regards to that, that's a poisonous aspect of it, right? That it really stifles the individual creativity.
I think the part that sort of stifles the creativity part is more the business side of today. Is like at the minute I'm just about to finish up a music business diploma actually here because I wanted to sort of enhance my business aspect of composing. So within that course, we have a recorded industry module, a publishing module, and the live industry module. I really want to go to actually study the publishing because it's just a super important aspect of being a composer, to know your copyrights and publishing and so on. But in the recorded aspects, when we look at today's music industry, and so much of the artists, once they're signed to sort of like a record label or something, so much of it is actually not on them. It's actually on like the A&R teams around them and the management teams. And they could have suddenly be sitting at home. They could be told, okay, this trend is now really popular. You need to record a track in this trend and get it out and see how it goes, whether they enjoy it or not. And then say if it does grow and people do really like them, well, then they're kind of stuck making that music for a while, even if they don't enjoy it because, well, it's blown up and they need to keep bringing in streams for record label and making money. And
for me, again, that's why being a kind of introverted person, like I'm kind of scared of fame. Like I would be happier if I was not famous at all. So if I never get to the point of being famous, that to me is not a sign of failure. That's almost like almost like a sign of success. But also with regards to that, I mean, Jacob Collier, I think, is a great example of a musician who kind of successfully subverted that whole thing. Because he just made his own stuff exactly the way that he wanted to, right? And then someone found him. You know, he got lucky, but also he's, you know, amazing. But Quincy Jones found him, and luckily, basically, it was like, you know, kid, you're a genius. I'll produce you, but you have complete creative control over everything. And it's so fun because you listen to Collier and people listen to Collier all the time and they're like, oh, I don't like his, or it's so different from what I've heard before, or his new, why is he making 4 albums? And it's just, I just love it because he just does whatever he wants. And like, he's not hurting anyone, but if the dude wants to make 4 albums, let him make 4 albums, you know? It's just, I just love seeing everyone around him just get, you know, and then finally realize actually, you know, the beauty of it, and then kind of
the music's amazing.
So I would love for everyone's individual, like I truly feel that the world would have better music, would be a better place if actually everyone learn how to compose. Now, I know that everyone is not interested in composing, and so that's completely not feasible. But the point that I'm making is just a philosophical one, that everyone is individual, right? We'll kind of make an argument out of it, almost like a what's it called? Like a 2-part philosophical argument. So, but everyone is unique and individual to some extent, right? We know that as a kind of like scientific fact, right? And then music is, generally speaking, for most composers, is a direct result of their brain and their experiences from their life. And so it doesn't matter what system you're following, you know, you're going to write something that's going to sound different than what I write, which is going to sound different than something that anyone else writes. Unless one deliberately tries to copy oneself, if you let the individuality flow, right, And so to me, it's not just a matter, it's not like you're not good at composing and then you get good at composing and then suddenly you make music. It's sort of like everyone has the capacity to be creative in their own unique original way. And I just wish that that was allowed to flourish more often, whether it's poetry or art or acting or whatever it is, you know, at all. And so the business side of things, although it is important and you know, in order to have a big giant infrastructure of music, like, it's, you know, to a certain extent, these things are kind of necessary. But the problem of squelching and stifling individuality and creativity, I think is definitely a real problem that needs to be addressed. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now, I want to look a bit more into sort of you. Like, I found your channel, God, I don't know how, I think over 5 years ago at this point. I've been following it for a good while. I'm pretty sure the first video I found was, I think, how to write colorful epic film music. Some of that was a Sibelius video. It has a lot of views at this point. Pretty sure that was the first one. But I wanted to sort of talk about your workflow, because anyone watching this, I'll leave JJ's link at the end, but he has a pretty big YouTube channel at this point as a composer goes. He has like 30,000 plus subscribers at this point. So much bigger than this channel. But you've kind of got away with not using a DAW at all, like Logic, for your videos. You've got away with using Sibelius the entire time, which is like kind of strange in this sort of terms of YouTube videos.
I know. And it's even stranger for another reason I'll get into, but
yeah, like I was kind of thinking, like, do you, like, you've posted a few Logic videos, but you've literally have barely ever done, like, it's really all Sibelius. Like, do you do that just because you enjoyed it? That's kind of your technological part of pen and paper, and that's just the way you enjoy workflow to write, and then you go into the DAW after, sort of behind the camera, not on YouTube, and then you do that sort of.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and there's a pretty long answer to it. So first things first, a lot of people, I think of me, just based upon comments that I read, as a kind of classical guy, you know, like a sheet music kind of classical guy. But I actually was very terrible at reading sheet music throughout my entire childhood. I was never very good with those kinds of symbols and things like that. You know, I was a very by ear kind of composer. And so if you put some sheet music in front of me that I could, if I'd heard it before, then I could kind of, you know, use my ear to help me out. But if it was, I never heard it before, you know, then I would be absolutely terrible at, like, sight reading, for example. So it got to the point where I wanted to essentially write a string quartet for live players, because I had started to study under Brett Inslee, who's a local composer, arranger, and mixing mastering engineer, just a great musician. And he was getting a string quartet together to play some pieces of music by his students. And so in order to write for string quartet, I had to learn how to use sheet music. And so I essentially, you know, then bit the bullet, you know, and downloaded MuseScore, which, you know, was free at the time, and learned how to use MuseScore. And but before that, I was using Logic and GarageBand. So I actually started out with the DAW, and then I switched over to sheet music. So now there are kind of three answers to this question. So first, let me clarify what I do in my own workflow when I'm writing music for different kinds of projects. And then let me clarify why I use sheet music primarily on my YouTube videos.
Actually, 1 second, quick, before I get into that, just for anyone listening, why I said this is sort of strange that JJ does this, because if anyone that follows YouTube videos within the music scene for composing or tutorials or anything, it's very common practice to see people make mock-ups within DAWs like Logic with full-on sound libraries and different things like that. So with JJ using Sibelius, which is a notation sort of software, it's a bit different. That's why I just brought it up. But
yeah. So along those lines, so that's the third point, which is, what is the objective kind of general advantage of using a notation software compared to, you know, pen and paper, compared to using a DAW? So maybe we'll address that first. So for me, it's actually interesting because, again, you know, technology develops, and the DAW is a thing, which was not a thing, you know, not long ago. And so there are a lot of advantages with regards to efficiency and workflow. So a lot of music that is written today for media is sampled, and, you know, people will be like, oh, you know, I wish it was recorded with full orchestra. It's like, yes, so do we all, but at the same time, you know,
budgets.
Well, it's also just like the studio system of TV back in the, you know, way like 30s and 40s and 50s was completely different from the way that things are handled, you know, today. just the amount of music turnaround that you can have nowadays. Because before, I mean, the only reason you were able with pen and paper to churn out so much music is that one guy writes the tunes, and a team of people arrange it, a team of people orchestrate it, and then it goes in and then is recorded in a recording session the next day with a bunch of musicians who work for that studio 24/7, right? We don't have that anymore, and so now, often what happens, I mean, just to show you an example, I wrote some music for the TV show called The Prophet. It's about this guy who comes in and fixes up businesses, the same way that Gordon Ramsay will go and fix up kind of restaurants, a very similar kind of format. And so I wrote a bunch of, kind of like just, just kind of basic kind of stuff.
Underscore type stuff.
Underscore, and sent it to them. And they ended up taking like fragments and little pieces, little bit, and you send them stems. And so nowadays, with regards to TV, a lot of times what you actually give people are kind of puzzle pieces, right? So you will create this track that has, it's, the full track has a drum beat and strings and maybe some melody on top. But the melody is too distracting to be playing while someone's speaking, right? And the drum set maybe only should come in when people are kind of moving from one location to another location. And so you give the client all three stems, and then they can decide how they want to. And then you also give them a 15-second version, a 30-second version, a minute version, one with an ending, right? And so with those types of things, it would be very awkward for you to sort of go, think about it, to have those individual puzzle pieces and then write them out on full score and then have live players perform them. And especially with regards to like, it's also just a matter of the style of film music today that we have, like, for example, just staccato strings, dun, 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 or like legato lines. People lament about the fact that that's boring, and there's a certain part of that I can empathize with, but at the same time, a lot of it's actually not really the composer's faults. There are two, A is just trend setting, and once Hans Zimmer and a bunch of other composers popularized that because of temp tracks, for those who don't know for our audience who doesn't know what temp tracks, a temp track is whenever you're writing a piece of music for a client, it's difficult to have a communication musically because the person that you're talking to often doesn't have any musical vocabulary. And so they'll say things to like, can it be a little brighter? And then you as a composer are like, oh my, what do you mean by that? Like, cause there's so many different, right? And so the temp track has negative and positive aspects. The positive aspect is that they essentially just say, hey, listen, here's a piece of music that's kind of similar to the vibe that I'm going for. And I actually like having multiple temp tracks. Right?
Yeah, so I enjoy temp. I don't mind them. Some composers hate them. Absolutely hate them. I don't mind them.
So for me, it's contingent upon. We can have a little conversation about temp tracks because it's actually really interesting. With regards to, let me gather my thoughts. So I don't think that temp tracks are inherently good or bad. I think it depends upon how both parties use the information. So if the client gives you just one temp track, well, the danger of that is if he or she is really attached to that particular track, then exactly. And they can't see the scene without, and the human brain kind of it's the same thing with like a melody, right? When people first heard Darth Vader's theme, they likely weren't able to hum it back perfectly, but after hearing it a billion times in the film and then in the album, then now everyone knows that tune, right? But the same thing is true with like, kind of like March of the Resistance. And my little brother was, we both went to see Star Wars 7, the Force Awakens, and we had heard this melody of the March of the Resistance, dum dum ba da dum bum ba da dum ba da da dum boom bum boom bum ba da dum ba da dum bum, right? When I first heard that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But Elijah said, I can't even remember that melody, so I don't think it's a very good melody. And I was like, Elijah, you just wait a little bit, right? And then he did, and now it's like, one of his favorite tunes. So, and I'm not making an argument about whether or not that melody is better or worse than like Darth Vader's theme. I actually happen to think that Darth Vader's theme is a better tune. But my point is, when you get used to looking at something a particular way, it kind of burns those pathways in your brain, and then it's really hard to reconceptualize it creatively in a different way. And there's also a certain amount of stress that comes with the process, where every time a composer is contacted, with the exception of special relationships like Williams and Spielberg, or James Newton Howard and M. Night Shyamalan, or, Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan, where they can look ahead of time and be working together with the script. That's rare. That's the exception rather than the rule. Most of the time, they just come to the composer. Everything's already done. They have the final cut, right?
Yeah.
And then they essentially just expect you to, and the music can make or break it. So they're kind of nervous at that point in the process. But anyway, going back to the idea of the temp track, if the client has multiple temp tracks, I think that's helpful for multiple reasons. If you just have one temp track, you don't know what it is they like about the temp track. And this brings up an interesting point about composers as opposed to non-composers, right? So if you are a composer, you tend to kind of differentiate the different aspects of music from one another. Like, I like this melody, I like that harmonic progression, I like that rhythmic figuration, I like this orchestral texture, I like that formal structure. Whereas someone who is not musical and has not been trained with those terms, they oftentimes don't know how to differentiate those two things. Like, the average non-musician doesn't even know what a chord progression is, right? Yeah. Understandably, because it's something specific to music. But they actually do know what it is because they can hear, their ear knows what it is. They know what it is intuitively, but they don't know it kind of intellectually. And so one of the things that I think is very important as far as communication is concerned is really trying to be wise about trying to figure out, and this is why working with the same director over and over again is actually helpful, because you can build a kind of relationship and understand what they mean by what they say just from the experience of working with them. But if if they come along and say, hey, I like this temp track, and you say, what do you like about it? They're like, I don't know. It's just kind of medieval sounding. And like, what's medieval sounding about it? Is the fact that it's kind of orchestral and doesn't have any synth kind of stuff? Is it the fact that it's like modal harmony that makes it sound medieval? Is it the fact that it has a very clear melody, And it could be any one of these things, right? I've got a funny example from actually, so I actually have written some music for 7 Days to Die, which is a video game, that is basically essentially like a Minecraft and zombie kind of apocalypse mixture and thing like that. Okay. So 3 of my tracks, I actually didn't end up. There were some revisions that had to be made, and they didn't end up getting into the game because the project basically was on a hiatus. And then when it started back up again, I had another thing that I had to work on. I didn't have time to work on it. But one of the tracks that I wrote for the game, I showed it to my client. And he said, okay, I like this, this works for me, but this section right here, 40 seconds in, sounds too medieval, right? And I was like, okay, sounds too medieval, right? So I made I thought it was a little too melodic for him, because this is this post-apocalyptic game. And, if you listen to like the Fallout 4, Fallout 3 kind of soundtracks, it's more kind of subtle melodically. You don't, little motives and things, but not like a clear tune, which has the danger of coming across as cheesy. That's a more traditional kind of Japanese kind of video game style of writing, very melodically. So I thought, okay, well, let me just make it a little bit more melodically ambiguous, so it's kind of more relaxed in the background. You send it back to him, still sounds medieval. So okay, maybe I'll make the harmony a little bit creepier, because it was kind of like something, something that was a little bit homey. Right? Just a little kind of like light kind of thing like that. But that doesn't necessarily, I was thinking like the moon is out, it's beautiful. And one of the points that we had talked about with regards to this video game project is that when the character travels out at nighttime, whenever it's a full moon and you're in this particular area, there are no zombies. And so it's just this one moment of beauty that we have, so to speak. And so that was why I originally conceptualized it that way. But anyway, I changed it harmonically and made it a little bit more, I probably used like a minor major 7th chord or something to made it a little bit more kind of creepy, so to speak. And he said, I actually I see what change you made, and I like that as well, but that's not what made it sound medieval. And so finally I thought, okay, he's got to be talking about like the clarinet, the instrument, right? So I changed the clarinet, and instead of clarinet, I ended up using a duduk, right? And funnily enough, as much as the duduk, I don't know, for our listeners who don't know what it sounds like, you can look it up. It's a beautiful, gorgeous Middle Eastern instrument. And normally, it's interesting if you kind of go through film history. I know I'm rambling on and on, but if you go through film history, the duduk traditionally was associated with Middle Eastern music, but nowadays is actually commonly used in even non-Middle Eastern music, just as this beautiful kind of emotional kind of melodic sort of sound in the background. So I used the duduk, and he loved it, right? And he said, yeah, that's great. Did you change the flute to a different instrument? And I said, yes, I changed the clarinet to another instrument. And I'm not at all making fun of him, because like the man was fantastic at what he does, and I would not expect any non-musician to understand. But that's a perfect example of the kind of communication. And so for me, to circle back around to the point, if someone has multiple temp tracks, then I can compare them. So if someone gives me like 3 temp tracks, all of which capture some aspect of what they want, I then can just compare them and say what's in common between all of these things, right? And so if this guy sends me like this track and this track and this track, and all of them are totally different, but they all have organ in them, right?
Yeah.
I can translate into this guy wants organ. And so, so having multiple temp tracks and make, also just the director not having an attitude of being overly married, but being more flexible. And part of that is just having trust, and I found too that a lot of it is not political, but it's so social. It's just like so many, even just revisions. Like so many composers are so artistically ensconced in what they do that the idea of like having to revise over and over again just frustrates them so much. But like from my perspective, like if I'm working for someone else, like, and sometimes revisions are frustrating, especially if the revisions genuinely like aren't good decisions. But that happens generally pretty rarely. Most of the time, if someone gives you a revision, think, okay, why do they want this revision? That's the first thing to ask them. Like, hey, I'm happy to implement this revision just so I can make sure to implement it correctly. What are your reasons for doing this? And then oftentimes they'll come back with reasons that you can then actually come back and say, hey, listen, this is why you want this revision. I actually understand. Let me just try this other thing that possibly solves your problem. And then you can give them something that is revised in a way that you are satisfied with artistically, but which they may very well like. Right. And so, and then again, that just has to do with smooth communication. Like every time I do, and this is also goes back to just, I had read honestly, when it comes to the whole attitude thing, John Williams to me is just the biggest role model. Like it doesn't matter whether or not you like or dislike his music or any of that, the man is such a classy human being. He's so humble, and every interview that anyone ever does, like Brian Williams, NBC Nightly News had asked him in an interview, like, do you ever just know when these are going to be the notes? This is going to be the theme that is going to be, that's going to sweep the world. And he's like, no, I honestly cannot say that. I'm just writing music, and I hope that it's the best that it can be. And he can say things like, it's important to understand that like I'm very appreciative. This is like him talking. I'm very appreciative that everyone loves my music so much. But like to me, like compared to Bach and Beethoven, so he's just such a humble, classy guy when it comes to these things, and is known to be super easy to work with. Whereas someone like Bernard Herrmann, a veritable genius, obviously a fantastic film score writer, was, an asshole to work with. I mean, like he just, nobody liked to work with Bernard Herrmann. They suffered through it because they knew he was going to write a fantastic score, right? So for me, just if a composer is going to be involved in any kind of media music, to just be friendly and understand the person you're working with is under stress and they're trying to please a lot of other people, and just, kind of, if they get overly like, you do this, it's to me, it's actually very easy to diffuse that just by being like, listen, man, I'm here for you. I'm your composer. I want to try and, satisfy your vision. I'm okay with revisions. We're on the same team here. Right. Well, at the same time, trying to offer, because the goal is not like, this director has a vision which is better than your vision for the score. And it's not about that. It's about, there are lots of different ways to write a good film score, right? There are lots of different points of view that you can take, right? Like even with regards to like subtext, as opposed to like the action on screen. If two people are having a battle, you could accent Mickey Mouse everything that's happening in the battle, or you can have a general underlying kind of like pulsation that maybe gives you the sense of the fact that this battle is a part of a larger war, or maybe like you have really sad music and no sound effects playing over this battle, right? And like Anakin and Obi-Wan is a perfect example from like Star Wars 3, for example, where the tinge of that music is a little bit different than some of the other battles. Like the battle between, for example, Obi-Wan and General Grievous, if you listen to that, that's like jump, because it's very much just like a physical kind of acrobatic battle. But when Obi-Wan's fighting Anakin,
it's like pulling at you, sort of. It's really
because like da da dee dee dam, and he has these 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 dissonances and things. that gives you the sense that Obi-Wan is really like truly broken up, that he's having to fight his brother, his good friend, you know. So anyway, to just give you an example of how two battle scenes can be scored completely differently. And so it's not that the director and you, the composer, are trying to figure out the right. It's you're trying to figure out some interpretation of the film in terms of how to score it from a spotting perspective that you both agree on artistically. And as long as you're both open-minded, you know, sometimes there's true creative differences and you can't work. But as long as both of you are reasonably open-minded, you can find some interpretation that is valuable. Once you agree on the interpretation, then you know that you're on the same page, and then you can actually go and actually write the music and then have a discussion and revisions with the, but I often feel that if I, you know, maybe just as a piece of advice, I often feel that too many composers getting the assignment are so excited that they immediately will just go start writing a piece of music. But for me, it's like a composer would be much less frustrated with revisions if they actually spent more time to try and make their first version as close what the director wants as possible without sacrificing your own creativity, which you know, is a result of communication and having, and that is easier to do with films and games than it is with TV. With TV, I mean, people are just churning out episodes, and you don't even talk to the producers or directors. You talk with the music editor who assigns you specifically what to write. You shoot it off to him. You know, he might give you a couple of tiny little bits of feedback, you know, and then he will give it to the directors, and then their editors will just mix and match the music. By the time the music is being edited to the show, the director is already directing the next episode and not even paying attention to the artistic process, right? Whereas like something like Game of Thrones, you know, maybe has a little bit more, although they still, if I remember correctly, don't use live orchestra. There's a little bit, the larger budget shows have a more kind of, you know, typical film scoring approach. So there was a thread somewhere of an original question that was asked.
We're back to your workflow and how you're using Sibelius and Sibelius
so
making your videos with Sibelius instead of a DAW.
So let me try and be more specific about that. So backing up to that, I guess the point that I'm making is that when you have staccato strings, legato in film and game scoring, that whole style, one of the reasons why that style exists is because that stuff is easy to sample. Staccato articulations and legato articulations are really easy to sample. If you look at like John Williams' music, he'll mix, you know, he'll have like slur on staccato and tenuto. He'll mix all these articulations together. That stuff's really hard to sample. So Williams is writing for live players and fully taking advantage of that. But samplers are writing for what works best for sample. So understandably, the music is going to be different sounding if the medium is different. Now, you know, slowly our sampling with sample modeling and stuff is getting to the point where, you know, that problem will be solved, hopefully. But there's also the advantage of like synths, right? And reconstruction. If you're writing, that's a whole, like, as much as, you know, everyone loves John Williams, like he just writes for a symphony orchestra, right? And so a part of that's just impressive that he manages to find so many different textures within that. But a part of it is also just like, it would be interesting if other composers explored more different idioms and mediums besides just the symphony orchestra. And so a lot of, you know, like Hans Zimmer, for example, explores, you know, sound design, audio unit effects, and mixing and mastering, and synths, and just, you know, so there's a lot of textual variety that film music has that Williams music. So I don't see it as like Williams is better than Zimmer, or Zimmer sounds cooler than, you know, I don't see it like that at all. To me, they offer completely different kind of creative options. But in any case, the original point that I was making to answer your question is that the DAW works better for that workflow and is much more efficient. There's no need to write it on sheet music if real players aren't going to play it. If you just perform it into your DAW, it's already in a DAW, so that way you can easily hand the project to someone to mix and master it. And you also can, in the DAW, work much more easily or with, again, audio unit effects and reverberation, things like that, which are impossible to work with in Sibelius. For me, the big disadvantage of using the DAW is twofold. Well, one, obviously, if you want to write for live players, for me, it's easier to just do it straight into Sibelius because that gives you the whole score ahead of time. But even if you're not writing for live players, because that's a big question, a lot of the music that I write, even if I were to write a film score, I actually still use Sibelius. My workflow, believe it or not, is Sibelius, and I go into the DAW. And so I'll kind of maybe take a little break to tell tell you what my specific workflow is. So this is what I do when I write a piece of music, and it's slightly different with concert music compared to like, but in any case, let's say I'm going to write an orchestral piece of music. So firstly, if I am writing something that where the sound is really important, so let's say like an 8-bit track. I've actually written a lot of 8-bit music on, retro kind of sounding chiptune.
Yeah, chiptune. Yeah, I used to love chiptune.
So I've written a bunch of those, and those I will not use sheet music, generally speaking, when it comes to that, for one of a couple of reasons. So one, I actually kind of like the way that the piano roll is laid out. So I always gotta be careful because there's so many different rabbit trails we could take here. But one of the things that I like about the piano roll that's different from sheet music is the fact that the piano roll, with the piano roll, it's kind of like set theory, where we map numbers onto pitches, whereby like a major third interval, like let's just say, to get a little technical just for a second. So let's say like we had like an F and an A flat, right? That on the page looks like a minor third, but you could also spell it as an F and a G sharp, in which case it would look like a second, right? And I could play all 12 different minor thirds that exist on the piano, but they're all going to have a different shape of like black and white to them. So that's all just a confusion because they're all minor thirds. They all sound like a minor third, right? And so the nice thing about the piano roll is, although you have the piano roll on the left to help you out, if you have a shape of like a 4-part writing structure, and it's the same shape, and if you just take it and transpose it to a different key, you just move it up or down. But so that, for me, there's a kind of clarity that comes from that can be useful. So if I'm writing an 8-bit track, I'll actually just write like saw waves and square waves and just write 3 kind of part counterpoint. And I think I can get away with that because of the fact that the counterpoint tends to be fairly simple. That being said, if I'm working on something where, let's say I'm working on an orchestral piece where there's a mixture of synths and orchestra, actually what I'll do is get all the synth stuff kind of like done first, figure out what those kinds of sounds are, right? And I'll still write in the DAW, but I'll have essentially both pulled up, right?
Oh, okay.
So I have the Sibelius project open up with all the instruments, and I'll label all the tracks in Sibelius just like I have them in Logic, right? So if I have this synth A, right, I'll label it in Sibelius synth A, but I'll just make it like a piano sound or something like that, right? And so for me, then I will then kind of write things on Sibelius and then look at what I've written and then try them out and play them into the DAW and then go back and forth between them. For me, I actually just like the Sibelius workflow so much better for a couple of reasons. One, especially with regards to Note Performer, which is, a third-party kind of plugin that is a huge part of what it's a huge part of my development as a composer, but Note Performer has like very decently accurate in terms of dynamic balance and blend kind of readings of your score. And because it's algorithmic and not based on samples, like with samples, you essentially just have audio files that are cross-fading into one another, right? So if you have like someone play a G, and then go up like a perfect fifth, right? To a note above that, essentially what you're hearing with samples is the attack of the notes, right? And then if you play that note, hold that note for long enough, it's going to crossfade back into a sustain without the attack. And then when you play the other note, it crossfades into a transition between those two notes, and then it crossfades into the new note, right? So all of this crossfading sounds artificial and it makes things lag. And that's why legato and with samples, it just does not sound very good. It's because like real players are human beings and they can, get their bow going before they need to get everything sounding good, and they can change their speed of vibrato and everything. Whereas like you cannot just have infinite vibrato speed options for any sample libraries or portamento, legato kind of. You can only have a certain amount of gradations. Otherwise it just gets completely unfeasible because you're recording all of these musicians to play this. It's already tedious enough to have musicians record these sample libraries for hours. But one of the advantages of sample modeling and Note Performer is that it's algorithmic. It's actually generating a synth waveform. And so if you have a big, giant, let's say a woodwind rod, it perfectly makes the legato speed exactly what it should be. The only disadvantage is that the tone quality is not as rich. So if it doesn't have that meat and potatoes of kind of like live orchestral playing. But in any case, one of the things I like about Sibelius is, especially with regards to orchestral music, is I just have a lot of intuition with regards to that. If one studies a lot of orchestral music, right, you kind of are so used to looking at the scores and so used to looking at winds on top, brass, and getting an idea of what a texture is going to turn into, how it sounds compared to how it looks, that, you know, that's just, there's a certain amount of just beauty at seeing, and you can see everything and it's all shaped differently. You know, you can see the slurs, you can see the staccatos, you can see the tenutos, you can see which instruments are playing together, you can see how many different parts. Whereas with the DAW, you know, it's like you can't really see everything. If you select all of the MIDI files, you just see this mess in your piano roll, but then you can't see in the individual differentiated instruments. And if you like, you know, zoom into your piano roll so that way you can see the instruments and you see the little notes, well, you still can't read what those notes are, and you still can't see what the dynamics are, articulations, because with dynamics in terms of sampling, you know, for legato you might use the mod wheel, whereas for staccato you might use velocity, right? And so all of that confusion, so in other words, I understand that the DAW, anytime you're doing something that's in a non-traditional orchestration, or whether you need to kind of spit out music really quickly, it's very, very efficient. But from my own personal experience, I write better music when I use Sibelius. I pay more attention to the intervals and what I'm doing. I can keep track of everything better. I pay attention to, and again, if you're writing an orchestral piece, to me, the big my kind of, so people, this last thing, answering your question. So people have often said to me like, oh, well, you know, or have given me advice, especially back when I was like 14 or 15, kind of asking people for advice about this kind of thing, about which workflow is better. They would say to me, listen, you got to use a DAW. Everyone uses a DAW. You know, it's like, if you want to notate it after the fact, you know, fair enough. You're like, but going from score to DAW is just way too inefficient. And so I just thought, okay, well, I can easily make up for that. Like to me, that's just like a cop out. So speed seems to be the issue, right? So can I write 2 minutes of music a day using Sibelius and sampling it, right? So that's the question. Is that possible for me to do that? And it turns out that I then took a whole big giant kind of, you know, 6 months to just focus on efficiency of workflow, right? So every single solitary thing that I used in Sibelius all the time, I created a keyboard shortcut for it, right? I then, you know, printed out little things on my keyboard to sort of memorize all that. And I basically just did a bunch of research and tried to figure out how to make my workflow as efficient as possible and, you know, get really fast with Sibelius and really fast with the DAW. And now it's at a point where, you know, I feel like I can comfortably write 2 to 4 minutes of music a day with using Sibelius and sampling it. And the only reason that that's the case is just experience composing music. Quickness of composing music is one thing. That's a kind of skill to develop, ear training and all of that. But the other part is just getting really fast with the programs and it goes back to kind of like something that the, you know, there's this famous kind of, I watched an interview recently with Lex Friedman and who has a kind of an artificial intelligence podcast. And he was talking to this guy, I can't remember his name, would, you know, put it in the description, who designs microprocessors. And he said a lot of people don't think simple enough, right? So if you kind of build this kind of system, you can continue to add extra bits of code that make it more efficient, but it gets to a point where you lose return on your investment. And at that point, you actually have to go back to the beginning and rewrite the entire thing from the get-go, right? And so for me, as far as like the DAW and sheet music are concerned, it took me a while. It's, in other words, if someone is going to sit down and learn a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, it's actually going to be more inefficient in the first week or two, right? Because you're not used to using these keyboard shortcuts. But if one develops those habits and things, it makes you so much faster. And there's also a kind of cognitive bias whereby we think like, I'm really not going to save that much time just by using a shortcut rather than clicking. But like, if you think about that mathematically, like shortcut, bam, like less than a second. Dragging mouse over to click, maybe, you know, 2 seconds, right? It's like 2 seconds, you know, half a second. That's nothing. It's like, no, think about it. That's more than twice as fast. And so if you do that with all of the little things that you normally click, it would literally amount to saving you hours of time. And it helps you be more creative too. That's another thing. People often will run into issues where they are working on something and they're super creative and inspired. But then they just run into some technical issue, right? And then they're just like, and then they lose inspiration because they got to go fix a technical issue. Whereas if you figure out all that technical stuff and get your workflow running as smoothly as possible and put in the work, then you'll be able to just keep the inspiration flowing, and which will additionally make you more efficient. But if you'll allow me to one more, so that's what my workflow is, always starting with sheet music and then going to the DAW. Oftentimes I will have them both open simultaneously. and go back and forth between the two. But the reason why I tend to show those things to my audience is kind of twofold, right? So one, I know for a fact that that most people know how to read sheet music. It's just a matter of comfort, right? So you can find a bunch of DAW kind of people who write film score music, and like, you know what? I would wager that like 95% of them, they know what the notes on the staff are, right? They're just not as fluent or comfortable with it as they are with like the piano roll, right? There are very few people who genuinely can't or have not learned sheet music at all, okay? So if we take those people as an example, the people who are okay at reading sheet music, when they watch my videos, I just go through material so quickly, you know, that I always hope to part of that is just my personality, but also part of me not slowing down, with the exception of like, I know it's hard for people with English as their second language, but a lot of people have short, kind of the millennial generation have short attention spans, you know, nowadays. And so going through things quickly, I think allows me to keep their attention. But in any case, the reason why I show things with regards to sheet music is because of the fact that it's much easier to notate things. So if I'm writing on sheet music, I can just essentially take something and consolidate it. I can take like a 2/8 notes and turn it into a quarter note, and it's very visually evident what I just did there. Whereas in a piano roll, I have to like copy the note over, just extend the length of it or something like that. Or, you know, chord symbols, right? On sheet music, I can just write chord symbols above the staff. And the DAW, I can't really do that unless I add those. And so for me, as a method of illustration from an educational perspective, sheet music is way better. And I don't think that's going to alienate my audience, because I'm also trying to teach people to read sheet music. Now, I'm not someone that says that sheet music is better than the piano roll by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think if one wants to learn from all these beautiful scores and masterpieces that composers have written that are just sitting there on IMSLP for free, waiting to be studied from, then you need to learn how to read sheet music, right? And so it's also kind of like, you know, if you think of Vsauce, this is kind of inspired from Vsauce. Vsauce said that he's entertaining his audiences while accidentally teaching them science, right? You know, sort of, and so people don't realize they're being taught science, and so that's why they like enjoying his videos, because they're not learning, they're enjoying, even though they are learning, right? And so another part of it for me is sort of like, I'm making these videos and illustrating them, and I chose sheet music as a better illustration, but also a reason for that is I kind of am accidentally teaching people to get better at reading sheet music, because the more videos they watch of me, seeing me doing things on sheet music, the more comfortable they're getting with sheet music. And I'm hoping that at the very least, that if people see my workflow and they see the kind of music that I write, they might at the very least be more amicable to just the idea of entertaining the notion that they might experiment with sheet music and Sibelius, just to see, you know, whether or not it might improve. Or for me, it's all about the music. What's going to improve? What's going to be the best for the music, right? Exactly. For me, I found personally that the sheet music it makes my music better if I write via that medium.
That's fair enough. Okay, so before we sort of finish, we'll have one more question with you, because you're actually saying about short attention span. So one more. Your book that is currently either being written or is coming out soon. What kind of made you want to start this? And then at the end of this, you can also mention anything about people finding your YouTube website and things like that. I'll link them all after this anyways, but we'll finish off on your book that you're currently writing, and kind of just a brief sort of explanation about it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So 21st Century Part Writing, the current working title, I may or may not change it, but that's its current title, is a book that, well, immediately one might think, do we really need another part writing book? Because there are a lot of books on part writing. But so I'll give you a kind of quick overview of the project, and then I'll kind of explain what my thought process, what the goal of the book is, what it aims to be, who its audience is. And so first things first, I raised just a little under $6,000 on Kickstarter towards the end of last year, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And so I've actually already finished writing it. It's just in the editorial process. The current hard deadline for completion is June 15th. So that is when the book is going to be released to the public. It's first going to be released on PDF, and then I'm eventually going to publish it on Kindle, although, you know, with the illustrations and audio files, there's kind of some logistics that need to be handled there. But in any case, I'm going to be releasing to the general public as a PDF with a big zip file, a bunch of audio files. And I also want to try and see if I can get the audio on like iTunes or something, just anything that'll make it easier for people to listen to. But anyway, the reason that I came up with the idea of writing this book is there are multiple reasons. One, a lot of people on my YouTube channel have been saying for me to write a book, because I kind of give little snippets of kind of disjointed information, and people are like, man, like you should just get all these ideas together in a kind of organized format. And I'd always thought, yeah, you know, I should do that. So it's just a matter of having the spare time. And so towards the end of last year, I kind of finished up my old projects, finished the musical, and I was like, okay, I'm going to write this book. Let me throw a Kickstarter to see how much money I can raise. The reason that I chose part writing, because I eventually want to write a book on harmony, on orchestration, on part writing, you know, basically just my own personal approaches to these things, and just hope that people can benefit from them. But my goal is really just, well, let me talk about actually my frustration with part writing books that already exist, and then how my book aims to attempt to solve, you know, some of those problems. So most part writing books, well, first off, most part writing books are actually just a part of music theory books. So you have a music theory book that talks about part writing, but also a bunch of other things, not just focusing on part writing. So that's the first thing. I wanted a book that just focused on, hey, you know, you've got a melody, you've got an idea, you've got some idea of harmonic progression. How do you then manifest that in such a way that you have multiple individual lines which all work perfectly together? And it's also just a matter of too with layering. I've noticed that a lot of, like there's this guy, I'll never forget this, from the Berklee College of Music. And he came from Berklee, and he had listened to something that I wrote, I think it was like Flight of Conquest or something. It was this really flourishing kind of John Williams-y style, you know, kind of crazy stuff like that. And he said, man, like, how did you write that? Can I take lessons with you? I don't know how to write music in that style. And I'm like, dude, you have a master's degree from Berklee, right? Surely you know how. And he's like, no, man, it's just, so for him, he wasn't really comfortable with counterpoint or part writing. He had all these harmonic devices and recipes that he used all the time. And he knew how to like take a melody and then just layer chords and things underneath it. But the idea of like just writing like a 4 or 5 or 6 part structure where you have like a bunch of just really nice individual melodies that all support the melody, that create this vertical, you know, chord, you know, harmoniousness in addition to the melodicism. I had always just loved that, and with regards to part writing. And when I went and first studied part writing, you know, back when I was like 12 and 13, it just totally transformed the way that I wrote music forever. I wasn't just thinking about layering things on top of one another. I was thinking about like creating a kind of clockwork structure that functions like that. But so most part writing books focus on like 18th century, you know, kind of music, right? And Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms. And I love that music as much as anyone else, but, you know, there's a conflation of style with technique, right? So I'll give you a perfect example, right? Avoid using parallel fifths because Bach avoided using them, right? You know, it's a perfect example. It's like, okay, well, maybe Bach avoided using them, or because someone else avoided using them, or someone avoided using them for some reason. Presumably there's a reason why this was the case. And so that ended up going, you know, kind of creating this giant rabbit trail where I studied parallelism. And basically there were so many reasons why parallel perfect consonances, and we don't have to get into the details of that at all, but just you know, give a couple examples. It's particularly difficult to write parallel structures for voices because voices have to hear their notes before they can sing them, different from playing an instrument, right? And because of the overtone series, if you have notes playing intervals that are on early overtones, they kind of get brought out. But there are all kinds of reasons why you want to use parallelism, and it's not like it's a rule. And so I feel like people often have these kinds of two attitudes. They're like, oh, I'm going to write music like Bach. If it's good enough for Bach, good enough for me, I'll follow the rules. And then other people who just throw out, they're like, but it's just, who cares about Bach? We're doing things differently nowadays. To me, those are both kind of immature attitudes. The mature attitude is to look at all these rules and think, oh, okay, obviously all these composers had reasons for doing those things. Let's examine the reasons underlying them, and then we can then use those reasons to apply, you know, to our own special situation. So I'll give one specific example from the book as a kind of microcosm of what the entire book aims to do, right?
Okay.
So doubling, okay? So if you read a traditional part writing book, If you double the root of a chord, you get the clearest, cleanest sound. If you double the fifth, kind of slightly less, good, so to speak. And then the third, worst of all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's kind of if you want to write in the style of Mozart and Bach, that's what you want to do. So what I did is I said, okay, well, why is that the case? And again, it actually has to do with the overtone series, right? So we'll get mildly technical for just 30 seconds for those who are interested, just to give an example of this in the book. If you have a C major chord, for example, the overtone series of the note C the overtone series of any note is essentially just a major chord. There are some other details, but so the note C gives you a C major chord in its overtones. These kind of, other pitches that you are hearing in the background, like ripples of waves when you throw a stone in the pond. So the note G has a G major overtone series. Now, what happens if you put G on top of C? It's like a C major 7 add 9 chord, not that terrible, right? What about the note E, the third of the C major chord? Well, E's overtone series is, of course, E major, right? And E major is particularly dissonant with C major. And so then you realize, oh, actually, let's put this in an objective way. The reason that doubling the root is the clearest is because of the overtones, right? And then one might say, well, why do you need that explanation? Can't you just follow the rule? And it's like, well, the problem with part writing books is they only focus on triads, right? Yeah. And so, but you can take this principle of the overtones and apply it to any situation. So let's say like you had a C major add 9 chord, right? So like a C, E, G, and a D, right? So the D is dissonant with both the C and the E, but it's consonant with the G, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason that it's consonant with the G is because the G's overtone series has a D in it. And so if you place the D on top of that G, so this means that if I have a C major add 9 chord, maybe I want to double the fifth because the fifth supports the ninth, right? Mm-hmm. And so understanding how notes support each other in the overtone series, I haven't encountered a single part writing book that talks about that. Ever. And there's so many things like that I've just learned from curiosity that just have not been addressed by any of these books. They're just descriptive books. They just tell you what people did, right? Rather than like how you can control, and to use that example, Howard Shore often will double thirds and fifths in The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Specifically for dwarven kind of archaic kind of muddy sounds, right? Whereas something like the elves might have a cleaner voicing. So for me, it's not like doubling the root is good, not doubling the root is bad. It's not about that. It's
just context.
It's that doubling these things give you a particular aesthetic, and then it's up to you to determine whether or not that aesthetic is appropriate in the passage and piece and context of music that you're writing. The determining what aesthetic is appropriate is subjective, but how to generate the aesthetic itself is objective. And so for me, that's really what my part writing book aims to do. It's not necessarily just to provide something that's completely unlike anything that has ever existed before. Rather, it's just to be a part writing book that is not focused on a particular style. I give examples from jazz, from film score, from modern music, from Bach, from Palestrina in my book. There's no differentiation between style. And it's just like, what are some heuristics and principles that we can learn to control the part writing structure to be exactly the way that we want it to sound? And anyway, so that's the name of my book. So it's the whole thing is also very thoroughly illustrated, and every single illustration has an audio file. That's another pet peeve of mine, and it's not really the fault of old, again, technology. Yeah. But like if you read like Rimsky-Korsakov, for example, you read Rimsky-Korsakov, and Rimsky-Korsakov talks about his music, and then there's score examples from his, and you're just like, I wish I could hear, and one of the things that I can do too, if we're talking about like part writing. Again, hearing how multiple instruments interact with one another. So like, for example, if you're creating a contrapuntal structure, you want to make sure that if you have melodies A and B, that A works with B, B works with C, and A works with C, right? You have every combination. And so in a book that just shows like a little excerpt of the Beethoven String Quartet, they don't show the individual lines. If it's good enough to have an audio file, the audio file will just show you some string quartet playing the full thing, but that doesn't help you isolate. So in my book, constantly, I'll be like, and I also, it's again, a matter of the fact that most theory curriculums are designed for performers and theorists, right, who want to understand the previous conventions of music so that they can perform it better. But a composer, what would a composer want? Like I, as a composer, if I was reading a part writing book, I would want the author to take some melody and some harmonic progression and then just show me step by step exactly what a particular methodology might be for turning into a part writing structure, you know, and, you know, start with the melody and then at the bass line, think about whether or not chord inversions help you to make a better bass line. And then start with what I call the goose egg structure, just half notes and whole notes, and then gradually add embellishing tones and discuss the nature of different embellishing tones. And even just, well, I won't go anymore. You can, you know, hopefully people will be interested in purchasing the book. So anyway, I should actually clarify though, June 15th is when the book is released to my Kickstarter pledgers, but they get it a month before the general public gets it. So for those who are listening to this who have not pledged on the Kickstarter book, you have two options. One is actually, if you still want to pledge, even though the book is not completed yet, you still can pre-order it and get it for a less expensive price. Essentially, just send me an email and you can PayPal me and I'll add your email to the list, and then you get it ahead of time and also for a less expensive price. For $25 instead of $30, which is going to be the final, you know, kind of price of the book. So if someone's interested in pre-ordering it and getting it on June 15th, they can contact me. Otherwise, if you just want to wait until the book's completed, it'll be available to the general public July 15th.
Sounds great.
So yeah.
Well, there you go. I'm going to wrap this one up here to try to keep this short, but we are 100% going to have JJ back on again to talk once he's willing to.
Thanks so much. I'm totally down.
As I said, all of JJ's links will be in the description of this video for whatever he wants to show, be his website, YouTube channel, Patreon, anything to do with the book. So if anyone's interested, pop into the comments. And if you are looking to learn any of the stuff we are chatting about or just find a bit about his channel, do pop by. He's posted regularly and there's even if there's nothing new for you to watch currently, there's so many videos to watch. So pop over to it. And I'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean. Appreciate it.